5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Dangerzone. This episode is the first podcast in a series of conversations I'm having surrounding the injustice that 2 Marine Raiders and a Marine Raider medic are currently facing. If at any point you feel you are missing some context, go back and listen to episode 41, where I introduce and outline the current situation. Make sure you also check out the next episode, episode 43, where I talk with Destiny Dreher. She is the wife of one of the currently accused Marine Raiders, Danny Dreher. She's also a mother, prior service member, and a Gold Star spouse. We discuss her personal experience and gain some perspective on how this current case has been handled so far. Today, I'm talking with retired Marine Corps officer Fred Galvin. He was a member of Marine Special Operations team known as the MARSOC 7, a group of amazing warriors and patriots who were wrongfully accused of war crimes back in 2007. He has never stopped fighting for justice for himself, his brothers in arms, and others facing injustice from military court system. Please provide your support listening to Fred Galvin's experiences and insights. Also, go visit uap.org, reconsniperfoundation.org, and reconfoundation.org, and ask how you can support these warriors and their families. Also consider writing letters to your representatives in the U.S. Congress and Senate. Make sure not to mention if you were a prior service or your name is attached to a certain branch of service. If you do this, the letters will be redirected from the congressional offices over to that branch of service, and they will never reach the representative. You can also attend your representative's town halls and ask them if they are familiar with the case and if they are willing to get involved and join the Justice for Warriors Caucus. For those of you that don't know, the Justice for Warriors Caucus is a nonpartisan congressional caucus to support imprisoned combat warriors who fought for our freedom and have been unfairly treated by the military justice system. So now, here is episode 42.
Let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure and the peace preserved.
Welcome to the Danger Zone, Fred.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
All right, so let's kick this podcast off, and why don't you start by sharing a little bit of your experience with the military justice system, and maybe give us a little background on yourself.
Sure, thanks. It's important for the listeners to know that this situation that's going on right now, unfortunately, history is about ready to repeat itself. And to talk about this, I was the commanding officer of a Marine Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan back in 2007. And we were defending ourselves. We were ambushed. A van blew up, detonated in front of our patrol right next to the Afghan and Pakistan border. And we started getting shot on one side and then the other side of the road. A car got dragged in front of the road, and a massive mob of men started to swarm, trapping us in that kill zone. We started taking sniper fire. Well, we, after being attacked, returned fire, killed the jihadists that were shooting at us. This happened at 9:03 in the morning, so that is important because the prosecutors tried to portray to the jury that some fog of war and that we snapped, and these highly trained Marine special operators just lost our cool, which is total. I don't like to use the phrase false narrative, as if it's what wimpy people use. It's a flat out lie. It didn't happen at all. And that's what every member of our patrol said. That's what my polygraph said. That's what was confirmed in 3.5 weeks, which was the longest courtroom trial in the Marine Corps' history. But the Marine Corps, to this day, is still trying to portray and deceive people like we did something wrong. And I say all that because it's important for your listeners, Dan, to understand that we got hung out to dry. They tried to send us to jail for the rest of our lives for allegedly killing 19 so-called Afghan civilians. Well, technically, because they don't wear uniforms over there, they are civilians, but they're also combatants when they grab AK-47s and sniper rifles and shoot at you and you return fire. But there's a very unfortunate case that happened 14 months ago in Iraq. Very similar. It's in this time they didn't try to run 7 Marine special operators up the flagpole. Now they're trying to do it to 3 Marine special operators. But these guys were there in Iraq, and one of the differences is they were attacked, but this time is by a retired U.S. Army Green Beret who was a contractor for the largest defense contractor in the United States. These guys go over there and often provide jobs for, in this case, a retired Green Beret, like I mentioned, and he had his fair share of alcohol. He was drunk, and he violently attacked. And these our 3 Marine Raiders were trying to de-escalate, trying to, push away and not fight. Is clearly recorded in the video. They had their hands down there, trying to back away, not trying to, go beak to beak and agitate this drunken retired Green Beret who was physically, bigger and agitated, and he's pressing the fight towards him. So as he was taking, multiple swings at one of these Marine Raiders, the other Marine Raider's buddy came in defending him, and with one punch hit him in the face, knocked him down. He sustained an injury to the head, but that's not what killed him. What killed him was several days later, after these 3 Marine Raiders had immediately treated this gentleman who was knocked out, had medically evacuated him back to base, put a watch on him. Well, he was medically evacuated back to Germany, and then over 3 days later, he died because he asphyxiated on his vomit. So, this is really the reaction to this aggressor's initial action. These 3 Marine special operators, they did not use weapons. They didn't, kick this guy when he was down. It was one punch. It was self-defense. That's what they have a right to do when they're, being attacked. Just like in our case, there's differences, but the similarity is self-defense. And just like in our case, we went to a trial in a military court there in Camp Lejeune, and that's what's happening to these men. So once the military decides they target you for termination, this is like, an Arnold Schwarzenegger story gone bad. And once the machine says that you are going to be terminated, the drones come after you. And except this isn't a joke or some Hollywood story. They've gone through the preliminary investigation. It's called an Article 15-6. Mm-hmm. That goes to a grand jury, which is a Article 32 hearing. And when it gets referred to a court martial, you're done. The military's conviction rate is 98%, Dan. And the next highest in the world is the People's Republic of China, not necessarily known for their human rights. So China's conviction rate, not just in the military, but their overall conviction rate is 92%. So we have the highest conviction rate, and these guys are being sent there for defending themselves.
Yeah, and charged with manslaughter, no less.
Yeah, something that on the books carries the death penalty still. But, people think, well, they're going to get cleared and everything. Well, look at recent cases that members of Congress and the President of the United States cleared gentlemen like Clint Lawrence. He gave the orders to people that met the criteria of conducting a hostile act or having hostile intentions. That meets the rules of engagement. He gave the order. These 2 men that were later found, were jihadists, proven, they had connections. Well, he gave the order. They were shot at, killed, and he was sent to prison in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas for 19 years, and he served 6 of it before being pardoned by the president. And same thing with Sergeant Derek Miller, separate incident in Afghanistan. He was sent to prison and he was serving time in Fort Leavenworth. These cases, unfortunately, happen more often than not. And the military, they control the narrative, which, Dan, as you know, the media calls that in the civilian world spin.
Mm-hmm.
In the military, they call it information operations. It's to control the narrative, it's to distort the actual truth, and which is what we call a lie. And you're actually allowed, in our U.S. military to deceive the enemy and to distort the truth, but you're not allowed to lie to the American people. And that's exactly what happened in the case that I was in. And even to this day, the military, you know, we've all, those who have served, have seen different military justice cases
Mm-hmm.
where they end in one of three, you know, outcomes. These are military terms, legal terms. It's either innocent, guilty, or dismissed. In our case, after we were charged with 19 counts of homicide, they said on a Friday night of a 4-day weekend on Memorial, they waited 4 months and they disposed of the case by putting one sentence out to one news reporter at the Associated Press saying that we acted appropriately. And
Wow.
yeah, for 7 years afterwards, we just kept getting crushed in the media all around the world.
So not even using the word innocent or exonerated or anything like that. They just said acted appropriately.
Acted appropriately, which the press,
Yeah.
they just ran on that for 7 more years until after I retired. And we were still getting beat up in the press after I retired. And after 3 articles were written the same year I retired, I stood up and fired back and said no. And I got our side of the story out, which is very clear. When people look into the case of the Marsoc 7, they can see what happened. And the military, never wanted to set the record straight. They
Yeah.
wanted to control the narrative, to distort the truth, to lie. And that's exactly what's going to happen in the case with these 3 men. People say, well, you really? Well, the reason I know is because the commanding general of Marine Special Operations Commander was my direct superior during our trial. And now he's just been promoted from colonel all the way up to 2-star general. And guess what's dangling over his head, Dan?
A job at the Pentagon or
A,
high up in
a
SOCOM.
third, yeah, 3rd star.
Yeah.
It's like Lucky Charms. Once they get it, one or two, they want that shiny stuff. So, and people think, what? Come on, you're embellishing. I'm not at all, Dan.
Yeah.
You know,
So,
there's a go ahead.
so a key trend I'm noticing here is these cases based on lies and the information campaigns done by the military from the beginning. Using these lies and destroying the truth very early on to fit whatever narrative they're going for. And in your case, I don't think we've mentioned it yet, is they actually believed they were using the information from Taliban fighters over the Marines' information. Is that correct? Could you talk a little bit about that?
That is true. So the Taliban, they immediately they have two outcomes. They attack us and they kill a bunch of Americans. It's a victory. Or the other outcome is they attack us, the Americans, we fight back, we kill them. And they had this tactic used, which is they employ these stringers or journalists that have pre-made stories that immediately got launched in the press. And that's we were our case with our Marine Special Operations Task Force was very early in this evolutionary cycle of, that's what terrorists do. They attack innocent people. They'll even kill, innocent Afghans and then make it seem like Americans. And this is what they did later on is they would just murder women and children and say that the Americans did all this. But in our case, they didn't have bodies, blood. There was no proof of this. They just immediately they pressured then the Prime Minister of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. They rioted in the streets. They took the press, and what happened? We I don't like to call them leaders, Dan, because you know what a leader is somebody like the guys in the Civil War that were actually like commanders. They took their hats off, they shoved their sword through the hat, and they said, charge them. They were actually leading people. But these so called leaders today, these are jellyfish leaders. These guys are sitting behind so many, barriers of HESCO and so much concertina wire. Their quote unquote combat deployment, it's it's a ruse that coward. I mean, you look at guys like General Yu and you see a short, he's not a gunfighter. There's a difference, Dan, as you very well know, of somebody that carries a gun, not just one on their hip, but one in their hands, and uses that weapon to kill the enemy. That's a gunfighter. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a big difference between somebody that just goes over to a combat zone and eats hot chow, this omelets to order made by these foreign nationals that, he's living in a lap of luxury, that makes daily phone calls to their wife, watches television and has the internet at their access. But Dan, they're not winning wars. And they're
No.
not even going, they'll do this battlefield tourism after everything is completely safe. They'll go out to some village that's been secured, and they're not going to expose themselves to any risk. That type of person is 180 degrees out of somebody that actually sees the face of the enemy, that has to enter a room with somebody wielding a weapon and is firing that AK-47 on fully automatic, and they can see the sweat on that guy's brow that's trying to kill him. That's a different warrior. And and there is a good reason that why these jellyfish leaders, these cowards, want to destroy. They look at with despise and resentment that other people that wear the uniform, that are actual warfighters, they respect and admire the courage and the bravery of these true warriors, and they realize they aren't anything like it. And unfortunately, when Marine Special Operations stood up, we didn't, especially in the officer community, we started just hiring regular infantry officers or officers who were with an intel background. A lot of these guys from recon battalion came in through these B billets or non infantry jobs. I mean, these guys were not what we always used to call, where were you on the third Thursday of the month? These guys didn't take the NDOC. They hadn't gone through any kind of selection whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
But then they formed from a 350 man force recon unit. They formed this big 2,650 man special operations outfit. So we had to grow quickly and much exponentially larger. So we polluted the gene pool and hired all these clowns. And General Dan Yu was one of these guys. He's a recon battalion guy, served a very brief time, but you know, again, these guys, when we say where were you on the third Thursday, did they take an NDOC? Did they wear a rope? Did they go through RIP or the basic reconnaissance course? No, these guys
Hmm.
short the whole system. They wanted what they got, which was their bling. They wanted their jump wings and their scuba bubble. They wanted, and you typically see these types of individuals. They're shorter. Not that that makes a person a criminal or a bad person, but often this is, hey, what can I get because I feel less, I feel weak. What's going to make me the for a lot of people, it's earning the title Marine.
Power.
And yeah, they'll end up in these organizations because they're trying to prove, they're trying to overcompensate. And am I going off on? I saw the trends over a 27-year Marine Corps career, and this is a common trend. And when these people get promoted to positions of power, one trend is they always abuse that power. How do I know this? Well, during our trial, then he was a colonel, Dan Yu, that's who's the commanding general of Marine Special Operations. He was my direct superior, and during the trial, he tried to act ignorant. Oh, I don't know that you're even going to go to a trial. I don't know anything about this. Well,
Mm-hmm.
you're my direct superior. The command is sending me to trial. This is the largest war crimes case in the Marine Corps history. And he played ignorant and dumb. And then after it was all over, here he's talking about behind my back to a gentleman that was trying to hire me to be his operations officer, totally destroying my character, slandering me. Characters, Dan, this is after the longest Marine Corps trial in the history, and we got acquitted. We were cleared.
So this
And
is
this,
yeah. So even after you're acquitted and cleared, he's still trying to defame you, still trying to push a false narrative.
yes. And the weird thing, Dan, is this isn't me hearing some rumor. This is firsthand knowledge. This happened to me. And now this guy instead of a colonel, he is a 2-star general. He's the commanding general of the whole organization. And just like what happened back in 2007 with our Marine Special Operations Task Force, so there was some prior instances that Marine Corps, your listeners may have remembered the Haditha case, the Hamdaniya case. There was a Marine Second Lieutenant Ilario Pantano. All these cases were boiling up at the time. And then by the time our case, ours was the fourth case that, came up, then they were like, we're going to have accountability. And so we were the ones that were sacrificed. Even after they couldn't prove anything wrong, they disposed of our case 4 months after the case was over. They had to get their whole story straight, and they dumped it on a Friday night of a 4-day holiday, Memorial Day weekend, to one news source, not saying innocent, guilty, or dismissed. They said we acted appropriately. This is what's teeing up right now. So these guys, all of a sudden, they've gone through the Article 15 to Article 32. Now they're at a court. They've been sent ordered to go to a court martial this summer by the convening authority, who's the ultimate guy in charge, General Yu, who's the guy who slandered me even after we were cleared. And, they cowardly disposed of our case, so the press just thought that we got away with murder. And I was facing that for over 8 years. And then now, these three men, they've gone through all this. Another very similar trend in our case, they said, hey, they knew that we could go to the press and get shine the light on what the truth really is. So in our case back in 2007, they slammed us with this order. It's called a protective order. Your listeners will know it as a gag order. It infringes on your First Amendment rights, the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. So they said we couldn't talk to the press. And during the courtroom, which the press was allowed to attend, they would constantly, for unclassified testimony, like character witnesses, just people saying, hey, Fred's a good guy. They took these people. These are people that hadn't even been in the country of Afghanistan. They took these people not only out in the lobby, out of the courtroom, they took them 2 buildings over on the floor above the little steakhouse there in Camp Lejeune, because they didn't want to have them hear any word, even from the lobby, of what was going on, just for good character. Not any facts of like, hey, this is what I saw in that. Nothing like national security. This wasn't a Jason Bourne case or Soviet missile program. This was a gun battle in Afghanistan. And now, guess what? One of these lawyers in the MARSOC 3 case that's currently going on gets told you're not going to be allowed to talk to the press. Gets this gag order from the convening authority. Again, they're going to try to control the truth. And that's a legal thing that you can do to the enemy, but you cannot use information operations against the people of the United States or against your own military.
Right.
This isn't training. This is real world. I mean, these guys are going to trial, and they're having their First Amendment rights destroyed because they cannot talk about their case. That's why as a surrogate, I'm not paid, or I've gone through this process before. I felt this invasive, it's not a legal justice or military justice case, it's an injustice. And with conviction rates of 98%, people need to stand up. And that's what I'm calling your listeners to do, is to be aware of what's going on. The United States military is the largest employer of active duty, reserve, government civilians, and contractors in the United States. The largest employer in the United States. It's what we spend more of our national budget on than any other line item for the U.S. government. So this affects millions of Americans. And knowing that we have this injustice where, let me explain real quick, Dan, how the court process happens. Say,
but before you do that,
yes.
I just
Yeah.
you mentioned that the First Amendment right of freedom of speech is being stripped away through this process. What other damage is caused by like this case against the MARSOC 7 against yourself? It's not just the loss of your First Amendment right. It seems like a destruction of lives. And so, could you talk to kind of what those second and third order effects of this stuff is, like on the the members themselves that were with you in this case and yourself.
Yes,
And
I'd like to do that. And that's one of the main reasons that, I wanted to help these guys on your podcast because I see what's coming to them. And I've gone through this, and it's something that's still, it's a scar just like any other injury that's happened, result of deploying and having something inflicted on you. But in this case, the damage that was really done. I mean, we were well trained. The enemy did produce a casualty. One of our Marines who was blown up, has a piece shrapnel in his arm, but that's not what affects any of us. It's the betrayal, the guys coming after us. And you see these weak leaders. A year ago, this article was in the Washington Post. It talked about how the Department of the Navy, Department of the Navy civilians, not even military, the military leaders never stood up to this day, like 13 years later, to this day. But the Department of Navy civilians, they evaluated this case and said it was completely unethical. They said
mm-hmm.
It was wrong for how the military did this. And the military, even after a congressman, the late Congressman Walter Jones, who died a year ago, he had a House resolution, an act of Congress requiring, demanding that the Marine Corps, make a public statement, say that, we were not at fault in the gun battle on the 4th of March, 2007. The Marine Corps ignored it for 2 years until he died. And so what this does when you're in when you're slandered, you're professionally destroyed, you retire, you leave the service, and you can't even get a job because you were in the headlines of killing 19 and wounding 50. I mean, basically slaughtering a village, 69 people, the death and wounded count. So what does this do? Well, first of all, you're a pariah. Your unit ostracizes you, and that's what's going on with these Marines right now. Is
Mm-hmm.
they've had their security clearance stripped. They've been disgraced. The command's talking about them behind their back. It's toxic work environment. This all happened to us. It's happening to these guys. And then once you say you get cleared, you'll most likely not get promoted, and you're going to get forced out because of service limitations. And that's what happened to me and other members of our task forces. So you get pushed out. Guess what happens to you when you get out? You have all this stuff in the newspaper and the media about you. You can't find work. And through this whole process, let me explain to you what's happened to our case and then why I've started to advocate so much for these 3 Marine Special Operators. Is there were 7 of us who were accused, 13 years ago, and one of them who went on trial with me, he was severely treated for a horrible cancer case. His platoon sergeant, his senior enlisted, he was treated for type 2 diabetes, which he nearly died from. The 7 of us, everybody who was married got divorced except for one. The financial ruin, the stress, we had one of these guys, his body completely shut down to this day, the production of testosterone. I mean, this has severe medical, financial consequences on not just the guys in uniform that are being, falsely accused of this, but it also it has it on their families. And people, your listeners, Dan, are probably like, why would they do this? I think the military is a good organization. I see these people in their uniforms and they're waving the flag, but you got to understand, and a lot of the listeners who've been in the military realize that, again, there's 2 types of people in the military. There's those who are serving and who are going in harm's way, and then there's those who are being served, who, the military tells commanders, unfortunately, as military officer and in command, and they have these courses you go to, and they say it's not about the money. It's all about the money. And to some of these people, to me, that's totally immoral. Did I just hear that? But for these other guys who are married and they have kids, they want job security. They want this thing to take care of them. And they're in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where these 3 Marines are. They're officers. You've been there, Dan. You've seen these little, quaint, beautiful, I won't call them little because they're not, these nice white homes on River Road. It's all about status, power, seniority. And so to these kind of guys, they will do anything to get that next promotion, that better assignment. And when, just like in our case in 2007, like I said, there was several other cases that preceded ours, and then they wanted to crack down and hold somebody accountable. Well, those people that are going to pull the rabbit out of the hat and do what their boss wants, and I'll hold them accountable. I'll show what good order. That went on with us. Even though we were innocent, they had to, you know, do this masquerade and distort the truth and make it seem like something was wrong. And we held them accountable. To this day, they won't even admit that we were innocent. They won't even use this phrase. And what's going on in this current case? Unfortunately, you had cases, that preceded theirs, and now the Special Operations Command, which controls the Green Berets, the SEALs. You had a couple of these cases that President Donald Trump acquitted, like the Major Matt Goldstein case, the Chief Eddie Gallagher case. Then there was this, other case where, the staff sergeant he died over in Africa, and then you have a case, where SEALs, use drugs. So Special Operations Command is cracking down.
Yeah.
They want accountability, and you talk to anybody at Special Operations Command down in Tampa, and they'll tell you, like, yeah, they. So guess what? The Marines are going to do? They're going to do just what they did in my case. They're going to make sure there's accountability. They didn't dismiss this after the Article 15-6 hearing, nor after the Article 32 grand jury, equivalent to a grand jury. No, they're pushing this to a court martial, which has, again, 98% conviction rate. So, and you're like, who would do something like, I mean, is somebody that bent on, like, who? Well, the convening authority, they appoint the convening authority. That's a senior person at the top, not quite equivalent of a judge. He doesn't oversee the trial, but he's the one that drives. He's the one that determines whether it goes to a court martial or it doesn't. And let me tell you two things about this, Dan, because your listeners really need to be aware of this. So in military jury, the jury members, so it's a closed loop system in Marine Special Operations Command now. So all these people that are jury members, they're reporting to this commanding general, General Dan Yu. That's his name. And
in this current case with the MARSOC 3.
Yes, so with the MARSOC 3.
Daniel Yu being the convening authority, and
yes.
Then you're telling me that the jurors. Can you say that again under that context?
The jurors in this case, they're inside MARSOC. So when they want, or if they aspire to ever have a promotion or a different or better assignment, if they even want to be retained, because it's a pyramid. There's not that many jobs at the top. So if they've been assigned selection on this, and they're going to carefully, they put out these questionnaires, and then they select who they want. So they're going to get the yes men in there that they want. And then these people, these jellyfish leaders that are on the jury, they're going to do with that convening authority. He's a man at the top who will ultimately make the final decision in this case. And so they're hand selecting these jury members these men will go and face trial at this summer, that are going to do what General Yu wants them to do. Here's General Yu, the guy that, after I was a direct, subordinate of his, he slandered me after our case was acquitted and tried to, destroy my career while I was in the Marine Corps, and eventually I got forced out because I hit service limitations. And even after a year ago, when the Department of Navy said, hey, what happened in the MARSOC 7 case was totally unjust, correct this, he never took, no Marines have came out and said, hey, what went on was wrong. These Marines, we've asked them to, even if they don't have the guts, which they don't, to make a verbal statement, that's what the House resolution was for, is to award the Marines the Marine Special Operator insignia. They're the minimum. Yeah. Like, just do a physical, an act. You don't even have to do it, but they said, no, we're not even going to allow that. And that's after 7 congressmen got involved, the Justice for Warrior Caucus, and urged, like, hey, fix this, right this wrong. That's how self-righteous the Marine Corps is.
For over 13 years now, this has been still not totally cleared up.
No, and you're thinking these are the plank owners. These are the guys who were the very first to be selected and trained, deployed, and fought and actually bled for our country as Marine Special Operators. Total denial. They won't even issue that. And you're like, who could do something like that?
And
Let me tell you. General Yu. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Is General Yu seems like the type to do it, but he's got a history of abuse and a history of double standards, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah. So here he's offering up these three enlisted men in his command in Marine Special Operations to be sacrificed when he is an officer and there's supposed to be like a higher level of accountability for officer leadership. And he was a captain. That's fairly senior rank in the Marine Corps. We give a lot of responsibility to Marine captains. You know, he gets on base, when he's a captain, pulled over and hit with a driving under the influence. And, you know, he wasn't attacked. He wasn't, somebody escalating, doing something against him is where he's just reacting. No, he decided on his own, like, I'll I'll get drunk. It's benefiting only one person, which is himself. It wasn't self-defense of any, he did this thing totally for the selfish reasons for himself as an officer, but he gets a second pass. He They allow him to, just where everybody else realizes you get a DUI, your career is over. It's
I,
done.
I've seen Marines kicked out of the Marine Corps for DUIs.
That's what happens. But he gets a pass. So it's very hypocritical for somebody who gets a second pass, but you usually see this happen, when especially a short guy, he's going to like ratchet down and like you see this. I mean, the Bible is full of cases where Jesus condemns people who, they're so self-righteous, like they'll throw the stone at somebody else when they're guilty of so much worse. Here, these guys were attacked by a retired guy who was drunk, who was swinging, who was aggressing, and they were trying to ratchet it down, but this guy wouldn't stop. They defended themselves, and the reaction to this guy's action is unfortunate, but they didn't intend to kill him, and they didn't sit there and dogpiling and choke him out and hit him with a weapon, or they treated him. They evacuated him to base, and they put a watch on him, and they got him out to Germany. He died days later, but here somebody who got a DUI, got a second pass. Now he's going to ensure, because guess what's at stake? His third star. That's what he wants. And when the Special Operations Command, his boss, and the Marine Corps, so he reports to two different masters, they want to make sure that, hey, can't have any of these cowboys. What's the deal? Somebody died. I want accountability. Well, he's going to make sure that he says that he held accountability, and that's going to get him his third star. I guarantee you, Dan, mark my words, this summer, unless your listeners write letters, unless your listeners go to the district offices of their congressmen and senators, unless your listeners go to town hall meetings and verbally stand up and say, don't wait to be called on, but they verbally stand up and say, I want to know what you're doing to dispose of this case. This is unjust. These people are being ran up the flagpole for defending themselves. And why are you not joining the Justice for Warriors Caucus led by Congressman Louis Gohmert from Texas? Why aren't you jumping on? Because a lot of these elected officials are weak, though. Well, I'm not on the House Armed Services Committee. I can't do anything.
Yeah.
You can join the Justice for Warriors Caucus. Don't allow these jellyfish leaders that we elected to get off easy. Oh, I'm not in the committee. You don't need, this is a caucus that anybody can join. And they need to urge President Trump to take action and dispose of this case like he has with others.
The thing that stands out to me in this case specifically against these two Marine Raiders and one Marine Raider corpsman, who are known to be professional men. You know, I know of them from being from the community, and they're stand-up men, and we're doing the right thing. They handled this situation in the correct way, and arguably better than most people would handle it. And I was surprised to hear that the so-called friends of this former Special Forces Green Beret contractor, the deceased, friends left him there.
Yeah.
And these, you know, these three defended themselves and then handled this situation, provided care, got him evac'd. Like, to me, they did everything they were supposed to do. And
Well,
in
that's Dan. Let me interject because you're thinking your experience in the military. You had a bias for action. You weren't a member of 10th Typewriter Battalion and just wanted to join for the VA or educational benefits. You wanted to be in the front lines and fight and serve your fellow man and medically take care of somebody who's wounded. That's your mindset. That was instilled into you by your family to do what's morally, ethically right, and what's courageous and brave. But our, again, jellyfish leaders, our so-called leaders today, they're instilling that basically you should run away. And I saw it in Afghanistan. You saw it, I'm sure,
Mhm.
that like when we were attacked, there was a patrol that was supposed to be coming through this village where we were attacked, an army patrol before. And we saw them doing their rehearsals, their prep for combat. And they literally were contact right. The little lady was yelling in front of her little patrol, and they would the turret gunners would duck down in their vehicles and they're like, drive, drive. So their whole procedure for the army was literally, if they get attacked, to duck and run.
Mhm.
And that's what the Marine Corps is thinking. Like, I mean, Dan, is it any surprise that after 19 years, we're at the surrender table negotiating with the Taliban to leave? And whose fault's that? I mean, people criticize Donald Trump, these Republican lawmakers. We can't be leaving Afghanistan. They could have planned another terrorist attack there. It's like, hey, radical Islam is spread worldwide. And that's the fault of our military leaders for not being able to take the chain off and unleash us
Yeah.
and let's just
It,
slaughter these people because that's what wins wars. It's not winning hearts and minds.
and even with the recent release of the Afghan papers, has pointed to the top jellyfish leadership not knowing what they've been doing in Afghanistan. There's It's just been a perpetuated process, and
Oh yeah,
almost intentionally perpetuated, because it's how people get advancements. Like you said, they go on their quote unquote combat tour, where they're sitting in an air conditioned building that was built almost better than the buildings here in the bases on US, with literally red carpets rolled out on these floors. um, and that's their combat experience. um, so it's clearly been an issue within the DoD, and I think that we're seeing right now what we're talking about with what happened to you, what's happening right now is um, is a sign of a systemic issue within DoD. Not only, and it's connected to the swamp politically in Washington, is sort of what you're referring to, and also the, the role of defense contracting companies and their
yes.
connection politically and within the military. Like Daniel, he'll probably go on. You say he's about to get his third star, but when he gets retired from the military, he'll be getting a job, high paying job with one of these defense contracting companies.
Oh yeah. And
Like,
Dan, you know that there in the D.C., President Trump campaigned 3 years ago on draining the swamp, and
mm-hmm,
obviously most Americans they know that the district was formerly a really ugly swamp. It wasn't as pretty as it is today. But the Pentagon is actually on the other side of the Potomac there in Virginia, but it was swampland too. Actually, lower elevation than the actual mall where the district is in, and why this is important is not just figuratively, but literally, the Pentagon sits on the lowest ground in that swamp area. It's when you look at here just a week ago, um, a former Department of Defense, official. It was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, John Rood. You know, he was told to resign, and he's actually going to be made effective here on the 28th of February. Um, but you say, so what? What's this guy's background? I mean, he came from, he was vice president both at Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, and you see, the current Secretary of Defense, Dr. Esper. He, again, senior level leader in Raytheon, uh, massive. So these people, it's a revolving door. People from the uh, defense contracting world, just like then general and then became president of the United States, Eisenhower. He said if we don't reel in the defense industrial complex, it'll become the fourth branch of the federal government, and it is what we spend the most money in our budget on for our U.S. government budget. It's the number one line item. So when you look at Dr. Esper coming from Raytheon, Mr. Rude, coming from Lockheed and Raytheon, we see the guy who just retired. He's not even on terminal leave. General Joe Dunford. He was a chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. He's also a Marine four-star general, the most senior general. He's not even off, like I said, the final amount of leave that you take, and he accepts a position. Guess where? Lockheed Martin, the nation's largest defense contractor. Um, so it's sort of like that movie about the Secret Service, Fallen Angel. You see these things, these organizations get so big, and they can lobby and have such great effects because there's so much money to be made in it. I go back to what they told us in these Marine commanders courses. It's not about the money, it's all about the money. And that's what it is. If you retire as a 3 or 4-star general, you're going to have these people court and recruit you to, hey, Dan, let me tell you about this company, Oshkosh. They make these mine-resistant armored personnel carriers, these MRAPs. I'd like for you to be a program manager. They'll sign some of these younger generals on, and that's what in the military, they don't want the straight shooter, the guy that says, hey, not on my watch. I'm not going to give into that kind of corruption. They want the weak leaders. They want the leaders who will go along with the politicians when they try to have all these social programs that get these. Why are they getting given these leaders in the House Armed Services Committee? Because those are the leaders that approve the budget for the Defense Department in the House of Representatives. So there's gonna be quid pro quo. There's gonna be weak leadership that they want, and they will go along to get along. They'll cooperate and graduate because as a vice president of defense contractor, they're gonna have to go back to these people in the House Armed Services Committee. They have to please, while they're in uniform, they have to please the Senate Armed Services Committee because that's who approves these promotion lists. So the Pentagon selects these leaders, but the Pentagon selects the leaders, but the Senate has to approve them. And they don't want, leaders who are, have a backbone and who are strict and straight and have morals and character. No, they want a guy like General Yu, who gets a DUI. He's going to promote his own kind of person, and he's going to do just what they want because that's his future. Dan, you probably don't have a house in Washington D.C. that you use as a tax write-off, and you get flown up there in a company jet from your house down in South Florida, where you have a yacht, and you're making like General Dunford. When you retire as a 4-star general over 40 years, look at the pay charts. Have all your listeners look at Google search military pay chart. Go 010, a full general's pay over 40, and you get $250,000. And at 40 years, you get 100% of your salary, but then you get $1 million to be a board member at a place like Lockheed Martin, and you get flown everywhere in the company jet. This is big business. Like a guy like you or me that left the military as a frontline foot soldier, we don't think of, this is how it can profit us, but that's what these people, and they're willing, and they're going to do it. And when your listeners just hit end on the podcast and take no action, they're literally approving these 3 guys who have deployed back and forth to war zone after war zone, have gone to Iraq, have gone to Afghanistan, have gone to Syria. They're allowing these guys to get sacrificed by some careerist like General Yu, who he got drunk, got behind the wheel of his car, decided, he's going to go when and where he wants to go, and they gave him a second chance.
Put Marines and family members on risk. Driving drunk on base, and
Exactly.
it's
But there's no problem with doing that
yeah.
because different spanks for different ranks. Here he gets free pass, but these three Marines, it's a means to an end. He's going to make sure the only way for him to get promoted is because people want accountability. He's going to give them what they want. So these guys are going to get sacrificed. Even at the best case scenario, their careers will be destroyed. The quality of life they'll be able to provide for their family is going to be limited for the rest of their lives for constantly deploying to a war zone. Different than what all these other senior officers, they've gone to a war zone, but it's different than being in the war zone and seeing the face of your enemy and fighting and killing that person before they kill you. And that's what these guys did. Is somebody attacked them, they defended themselves, and now they're being sent. It's totally different on your mind when you have the system which has such a high conviction rate. I mean, we don't go to war that we think that we're going to have a 98% rate of that we're not going to survive. We don't fight under those conditions. But that's what these guys. This affects their whole entire family. It's disgusting. And your listeners, I'm telling you, they really they must. You know, it's pretty simple. All they need to go a couple courses of action. They www.congress.gov/members. Look up your representative, go to their district office, make an appointment to see them face to face. If they won't see you face to face, they're a coward. Make sure you go to one of their town hall meetings or rally and don't wait to get called on. Stand up and say, what are you specifically doing about these three Marine Raiders who are being sacrificed to be destroyed for these other Marines, officers' careers? Because that's what's happening. If they write letters to their congressman or to the president, they need to have two things. They do not want to ever mention that they were in the military or are in the military, because those letters get screened and get sent directly to the service via either the White House Communication Office or the Office of Legislative Affairs. These are control mechanisms that send those letters directly to the military, and the lawmakers don't, or the president, they don't see those. So it just needs to say, this is who I am. I'm not in the military. But I'm Joe Schmo from Pigs Knuckle, Arkansas, and here's the deal. I understand that this is the case, and this is the relief that I'm requesting. And the relief is to dispose of this case. And
exactly. So what for somebody listening to this and who hears like, okay, you're saying this case with this three is clearly self-defense, and maybe they're hearing some of these points. Like, I think it's important to answer the question: why should this case be disposed of, and why should it not even go to court-martial? And we've kind of like we've hit on some of these things, but for the person that just got told, hey, you need to go talk to your congressman, senator, representatives, hopefully get the Justice for Warriors Caucus, maybe able to talk to Trump about this. This case is different. It's even different than the ones that have been recently in the news. It is clearly self-defense. These guys are facing possibly the death penalty for a manslaughter charge. What are some of the other reasons that this shouldn't go to court-martial?
well, the bottom line is the punishment doesn't fit the crime. These guys were attacked. They they used the whether you're a Marine, and I'm just speaking because I served in the Marines, but you're taught in boot camp. Marines only destroy the minimal amount. They only use, whether you're a breacher in a special operations unit, you only use the minimal amount of explosives to defeat, your target. And
Proportionality,
that's,
yeah.
yeah, proportionality. That's exactly what these guys did. Is they saw the threat, they identified it, they did exactly what we were trained. They used the least amount of force, but they resolved it, and they didn't, then jump on and attack and kick and follow up with punches. No, what they do, they medically assessed him, they treated him, they evacuated him back to base, they watched him, and then they got him evacuated to, you know, military treatment facility where he later died several days later. So this sending it to a court martial, people, they struggle. They wonder, like, well, isn't the military justice system? No, it's not fair at all.
Yeah.
I mean, in our case, they were more than willing, and they've totally covered it up since then. I mean, look at our case. You know, Search Marsoc 7. No military official has came out and said these guys were innocent. They haven't awarded their badges. They forced these guys out. I mean, the financial struggle that, when Dan, you've always heard, like, you guys get a DUI, what do they say? Uber fares maybe $50, but it's like 15,000 to fight a DUI case.
Yeah.
Well, that's for DUI. That's much less, I mean, time and money that's going to be involved in something such as manslaughter. These guys are they're charged with manslaughter. Try to retain an attorney for that, it's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars. I'm telling you from firsthand experience. This is not cheap. And, what, Marines have that kind of cash laying around in a, Swiss bank account. The
Well,
fact of the matter is they don't.
not only that, they have families to support, and in this case specifically, some of them have already been punished with special pays being taken away. They've
Clearances removed.
Yeah, clearances removed, and you know I know at least one of them got assigned to a job at a gym. We're talking
Yeah.
about a special operator working like the front desk of a gym. Um,
Yeah, it's a
it just
shame
it's
with them.
there's been no presumption of innocence
No,
whatsoever. I think that's important for listeners to hear too. Is the military justice system? I can't reiterate it enough. 98% conviction rate, higher than communist China. Like there's the the jurors report to the convening authority. You already talked about that. There hasn't been this presumption of innocence. They've already been punished. They're they're overcharged with manslaughter. They just stack these charges on,
no.
and
Well,
then
and the permanent damage to their reputations in the
mm-hmm,
military, and then say they get out. I mean, unfortunately, as a special operator, you've got all these special skills, but when you get out, you have to serve in these niche things that are using these skills because we're not trained in information technology or unless I even went out and got an MBA and started a PhD, but you're you're struggling because people your age who have all this civilian work experience and educational experience, they're further ahead and they've got much more connections in the workforce. But so if you try to use your military skills and say you want to, like this retired Green Beret who was working as a contractor overseas with Lockheed Martin, surprisingly. Well, if you get a job like that, guess what's one of the first things they ask? Do you have a security clearance? Have you ever had your security clearance suspended? So
yep,
you're right, Dan. There is no presumption of innocence because if you answer that question truthfully, which would be in their case, yes, you've had your security clearance suspended, which is not in presumption of it, fall in line with our constitutionally protected presumption of innocence, then you know, you're likely not to get a job. And I found that out firsthand. I had my security clearance throughout the whole time I was in the Marine Corps. They didn't actually suspend it. But then after I got out in 2015, after I retired, I started making our case publicly known in the press. And the Marine Corps went in and pulled my clearance, even at which I still had at the time, but they pulled it.
after y'all were proven innocent,
Yeah, there's
just
so
for speaking out against them. Wow.
it's a fact. So when you look at this hypocrisy, like what does it say on the apex of the U.S. Supreme Court? Equal justice under law.
Mm-hmm.
America is a society founded on laws. When you look at this hypocrisy of a guy like General Dan Yu who gets a DUI, do you think that's equal justice that he gets a second pass and now he's the one that recommended these guys go to court martial after their Article 32, which is equivalent to a grand jury. People are like, well, why would that they're going to have this dismissed. No, because that's what the grand jury process is for, is to determine whether it's going to go to like a felony equivalent. And he was the ones like sending it to a grand jury. So he wants this to happen, and it's going to happen. And these three men, unless your listeners contact their congressman, write a letter to the president's a little bit more difficult
Yeah.
to contact. But if you put anything in there that you're a veteran or you're active duty, it's going to go from the White House communication office. It gets intercepted. The president doesn't use this silver letter opener and read his own mail. So he gets it screened, and it's going to go straight to the service. So the service is going to realize, oh, okay, all these people are contractors.
Yeah.
So they're going to
Oh, let's hide
develop,
that.
yeah, they're going to have this carefully crafted narrative that if a member of Congress or the president asks, they're going to have this very well written, soft sounding thing that, sounds so eloquent.
Hey,
And that's,
let us do our jobs.
yeah, it'll answer the mail and dismiss this whole thing. But your listeners, I urge them, and I'm not affiliated in any way of board membership, but the United American Patriots, I'd like to, and the Recon Sniper Foundation, these organizations are currently financially supporting the legal funds for these three Marine special operators who are unjustly being accused of manslaughter. And if they go on like UAP, that's for UnitedAmericanPatriots.org, UAP.org, they can, and I've done it myself. I have donated to it, but I'm not on the board or affiliated with them. It's just they are legally. When I went through this process myself, uh, I couldn't directly pay these Marines, the ones in my command. So I worked with a gentleman who went through a similar process, Ilario Pantano, and uh, we set up a legal defense fund for the 5 enlisted Marines that were in my task force that were being charged.
Mm-hmm.
And it paid off those legal fees for just those 5 Marines. And that's what's going on with these 2 Marines in Sark Corpsman who are being falsely accused here. There is no, as I said, there's no equal justice under the law in this case. There's no presumption of innocence.
Well,
They
and also JAGs act with impunity. I think I heard somewhere about one of the other cases you mentioned earlier, not your case, but there was bio data from the fighters that were killed, attaching them to IED making or weapons and stuff like that, and that information was hidden and they're
suppressed.
suppressed. And then there was another case where a the prosecution, their own expert uh, aut- person performing an autopsy, said that there was self-defense wounds, and
Yeah.
they hid that as well. And basically, um, so
I want to comment on that because, like in Clint Lawrence's case, they did find those people that he ordered attacked. They were connected to terrorism, factually, and that evidence was suppressed. And in our our own case with the Marsoc 7, there was multiple. So the post blast analysis was done by an organization called Task Force Paladin. Is a joint unit, but the the senior Army explosive explosive ordnance disposal team chief went out there. He did the assessment when we were attacked and found that the damage that was done to our vehicles was from direct fire. It wasn't only from the blast.
mm-hmm.
Well, that information was submitted to the investigating officer who completely omitted that from his report. And not only did he omit it, he went back to that, Army team chief multiple times and tried to coerce him to change his report. And that Army leader in the courtroom stated, and this is the thing, is the Marine Corps knew what this guy's testimony was going to be, so they took the press out of the courtroom.
Wow.
This guy's testimony.
Surprise, surprise.
So, yeah. And then you had uh, in our case, there was just so many gross abuses, not just this Army leader, but we had our interpreter, Afghan interpreter who was on the patrol. He made a statement and said we were fired upon by the civilians or these jihadists. And he asked him, even in the courtroom when he took the stand, and they said, well, did you make a statement to the preliminary investigator? He said, yeah, the Air Force colonel. Yeah, I made a statement. He admitted his statement. And and the jury even asked, they said, how did you know it was AK-47 fire? He's like, well, I grew up in Afghanistan. I mean, the AK-47 Soviets came and here AK-47s all the time. But that was dismissed. Again, his testimony, unclass. I mean, this is Afghan, so he doesn't have security clearance. He's not talking about anything. Again, he's not Jason Bourne.
Yeah.
Uh, so, but the media was not allowed to be in his testimony. Another Marine who was a driver in vehicle two, who was threatened to have his mother deported unless he signed the prosecuting attorney's pre-made statement saying that we fired wildly. I mean, this is so immoral that he had to make a decision between his blood family and his brothers in arms. This all came out in the courtroom, but guess what? Media wasn't present during his hearing. And you know what his responsibility? He wasn't there to, you know, take the blueprints from the spy satellite. No, he was the driver of a vehicle. And his crime was that he decided, having legally immigrated to the United States, to serve his country during time of war and in a special operations unit. I mean, but again, that didn't come out until after I retired. And Dan, I've been on dozens, literally, of public, interviewed in the press, the media, television, online, you name it. The Marine Corps has not disputed a single word. They just don't answer this kind of stuff. And that shows how when you are wrong and you don't correct it, you don't even acknowledge it. This is the same system that is got these two Marine Raiders and this corpsman in their reticles, in their sights, and they're going to pull the slack out of the trigger and they're going to put a shot right between each of their heads.
Yeah.
And if your listeners sit back and they don't contact their congressman and say, dispose of this case, they don't say, join the Justice for Warriors Caucus, which doesn't cost any money.
Yeah.
They don't contact the president and say, dispose of this case.
They don't have to have knowledge of the military. They just need to believe in justice for all, right?
Yeah. There's no equal justice in this case. If they don't do anything, these three men will be sacrificed, and this bureaucrat, this guy that's in it just for himself, General Yu, he's going to get his third star, most likely his fourth afterwards, and that's why he's going through this process, because you can never be wrong if you do these investigations, and nobody's going to see the trail of your influence when you do what you did. What happens in these military justice cases like in ours, it happens in all of them. They send out these questionnaires, these potential jury members, so they know exactly the kind of person they want to get on that courtroom, and they select their jury, and that jury will all have, they all work in the Marine Special Operations Command, and their promotions, their assignments, their retention in the service is all directly affected by the convening authority, General Dan Yu. So, why this process is allowed to proceed this way, it is so unethical. It's not like anything else we have in America. And this is just another example of investigations gone wild, why it needs to be, this case needs to be disposed of right now.
Yeah, and so definitely there needs to be action taken on this, because the court martial, I believe, is scheduled for June sometime frame.
Yes.
So not only going through the steps you mentioned of, going on congress.gov, contacting, writing letters, but also showing up to the town halls and trying to get these questions placed on them. Have somebody video with your phone as you're asking the question, so you can get the response of your representatives on camera and share that if they try and just blow it off. And so people are held responsible, and we can bring some accountability into the DoD system, but there needs to be immediate action in this case specifically. So, because they are facing, death penalty, years in prison for bullshit, for a lie, and it's wrong, and something needs to be done about it. But unless we do something about, continuing on with the DoD system as a whole, this is going to continue to happen.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'd like to talk, a little bit about that. We've touched on it some, but there's, like you said, the Pentagon is literally the lowest point in DC, in the swamp. And you know, I want to, somebody might hear that and it just, they're thinking like, oh, drain the swamp, that's like, a token phrase or something. But these political systems that are attached to our Department of Defense, like I did some research before this podcast. I went on the Department of Defense website, and you can just, when you start going on these things, you can see their mission statement. The mission of SOCOM, the SOCOM truce, like their own. They're not even adhering to their own
No.
principles or teachings. It is a total two-faced system. But I just go on the DoD website and looking through the profiles of some of these people, it just looks like a bunch of dirty politicians. It just, they just ooze that aura of filthy politicians. And that's on the DoD. This isn't looking at, you know, your representatives in Congress or the Senate. Um, this is within the Department of Defense, which falls under the commander in chief's control. And so ultimately, we need some drastic action within the DoD system to change this culture of, toxic commands, toxic jellyfish leadership, um, the the perpetuated wars that we're in by these
Forever.
cozy relationships between, you know, Congress, who finances the DoD, and the people who profit off of these wars, who want to see them continued, and then the commanders inside the military who are building their careers. They're getting their yacht, their mansion in DC, all this stuff set up on literally the blood of some of the greatest patriots in our nation, on,
You know
on
how
their
much
on their
work?
sacrifice. And
Yeah.
here, in this case, they're gonna sacrifice not only these guys, but their families, their loved ones, not even their direct, their wives, their kids. They're gonna try and ruin their marriages. There's, their family. What is their father, mother, you know, relatives? There's so many people affected by this. And not only that, you had mentioned earlier the DoD being the largest employer of people inside the U.S. It's so large. That's why it this this Pentagon being the swamp. We can easily say that and say, oh, and that's kind of out of sight, out of mind. But I don't think people understand the scope of DoD and how big this ripple effect is. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah. And you're right, because it affects literally millions of direct employees when you talk about all the active, the reserve, the government civilians, the contractor positions. Then look at their families too. So this is a huge swath. And I saw this because after I retired, I founded a Gold Star Family charity and for Mid America families that took people to athletic events, and one was with the NFL, and the NFL, after that moron Colin Kaepernick decided to kneel down and sit down during the national anthem, they realized, especially in the Midwest, where so many people joined the military from, that this was having a massive financial setback on their bottom line, their profits. So they were wanting to do more engagements with Gold Star families, um, and I was also doing a lot of pro bono work with military flyovers and having the coordinating military events, uh, because this affects a lot of people, especially in certain areas of the country. And that's why your listeners need to make sure their representatives are doing something. And why they get away with this kind of stuff, it's, you know, this is how military leaders, in their minds, the perception is they look good when they stand there in their uniform and they have they're carefully groomed. They look great with their little high and ridiculous tight haircuts, and they have these carefully crafted words. They look good because they're holding these people accountable at a high standard. But the real it's a magic trick. Like in magic, you use misdirection to get somebody to focus on this stuff over here, so you don't have to answer these questions about why we've spent over $2 trillion in two countries that have only gotten worse. And there's more jihadists now. It's gone global. It's not just contained in Iraq and Afghanistan and maybe some outlying countries like Syria and Iran. This has gone over the entire continent of Africa. It's gotten worse because we're trying to win their hearts and minds. The enemy realizes that we're weak, that we don't have any warrior leaders.
That were corrupt.
That, yeah, we're as corrupt as they are. And we use this misdirection to focus on punishing these guys who are doing the right thing. You look at 13 years ago, our case, we got ambushed, we got blown up, we got trapped in a kill zone in the middle of the morning. It wasn't this narrative fog of war. We snapped, or we were poorly trained, and we were just trying to get out of Dodge. We sat there in the kill zone for 5 minutes. We returned fire, and we killed all the people that were shooting at us. And the first attack came from the car bomber, and then we were attacked by these vehicles coming down this unimproved trail we fired directly at. So there was no civilians killed in the backdrop of this dirt road leading nowhere. Like they try to say, oh, well, some people could have been killed in the crossfire. No, the other guys we shot out on the other side of the road were in a dry riverbed. So this whole perception that even the military is, nobody was innocently killed at all. But again, misdirection. Get them to focus on something wasn't right. And that's what they're going to hang these Marines. Just like the case 13 years ago with our case, just like today. It's tried in North Carolina. You know what happened a couple hundred years ago, Dan? The witch trials in North Carolina? We're having a 21st century witch trial.
Yeah.
And there's going to be some innocent people hanging, but these people decided, when they were teenagers, to answer their country's call and to serve and fight on the front lines. They weren't cowards trying to carve out a beautiful career for themselves or a second career. Their second careers will likely be like a lot of other special operators. They're gonna be required to go overseas in godforsaken places in Africa, in the Middle East, and risk getting shot at and being separated from their families forever. They're not going to be these guys that get flown up in the Gulf Stream, from South Florida to their second home in DC and write the whole thing off and do a little TV interview, and look good. And that's how this whole thing works for these guys. They are the float princesses that do the little curtsy and wave their little hand and look. These are perfume princesses, and it's disgusting, and it needs to stop. And without focusing on the enemy right now, the first step is, again, contacting their congressman at www.congress.gov/members, find their congressman, go to their office, go to their town halls, make this a public, so when they are trying to rally, stand up, hey, dispose of this case. These guys are being hung out to dry for self-defense. One punch from somebody that was attacking them. He later died, and now these guys are being charged with manslaughter. It's a disgrace. But, congressmen, at the end of the day, it's how they become an elected official. It's a popularity contest. They're trying to please people. They're going to try to, slide around an answer, but you have to continue the pressure.
And follow up with, if you tell them, like, hey, we need action to dispose this case, and the military needs to be looked at to get an overhaul on its justice system. Because let's talk a little bit about how it got, this idea from my research on how the court martial system works. It's basically to quote unquote instill good order and discipline. They can basically do whatever they want.
So true.
Is my understanding of it, and it's ridiculous. And like I pointed out earlier, if you have these double standards where you have these little jellyfish, and I know exactly when you're describing these officers, I know exactly who you're talking about. They're they they're grasping to power. They're a
Right.
classic representation of a power trip. It's the way they feel strong. It's the way they, they're faced with these super honorable men who are good at their jobs and very capable and
And
honorable,
they
and
hate
then
them
they say,
because
well,
they represent everything that they are not. So
hmm
that's why they hate them so much. And they're going to drive this outcome
and
to have it be
they
hanging.
think the way that they can be better is tied to their ego. It's tied to finances, and it's like you said, it's all about the money and it's about the power. And so, just because they can, you know, quote unquote, instill good order and discipline, they will, because it's their power move. It's their way of saying, "Hey, you're a better man than me, but guess what? I still have the power to do this to you." You know.
Yeah.
Um,
And they control the narrative. They control what goes out to the press,
yeah.
just like it's happening to the attorney in this current case. You know, telling him he's not allowed to go to the press. I mean,
Yeah.
why would you want to do something like that unless you have something to hide?
And
And then they
this
try to
here,
say it's to protect the accused. Come on, give me a break.
yeah.
I went through that, and that would have been a very valuable tool for us to use, but they took it away,
So
totally against our First Amendment rights.
so these hearings are supposed to be public. I mean, you explained how in yours they would take the press away during key points.
Yes.
Can people, veterans and whatnot, go attend this? If it, let's say it does, if we can't get it disposed, can the public show up to this court martial hearing, and you know, sort of listen in and be able to report on what's happening in this case?
That's a good idea because I would recommend not just that the public, but that you know, you know, uh, former military members who may still have their security clearance, especially if they work for, you know, some government agency where they have an active security clearance, and when they
Mm-hmm.
try to close the door and not allow people to hear it, um, and they shouldn't be able to do so. When if we had talking back in our trial during 2008, if we had people that could hear this,
Mm-hmm.
and so what I had to do is I had to fight for years. We had to actually threaten to go back into a civilian court to have the courtroom transcripts released. They were heavily redacted, so basically all the nouns of whether it was where it was or who was saying this, all the nouns were redacted. So it basically took somebody who was in the courtroom to be able to explain it. And I've done that since then in the press, and you can read all that stuff. And when readers go on something, especially like the 5-part series in the Military Times, or Nick Kaufman from SoftRep has covered this extremely in depth in a very long 5-part series, which just shows the complete abuse of authority and the corruption. I mean, when you see that and you cannot clear, I mean, and it's not like, oh, this is Fred Galvin's version. These were the sworn testimonies from the courtroom. The only thing I provided was those nouns that were redacted of who was saying what about where something occurred. So um, it just showed you how they used investigators to distort the truth. That it's also very interesting and sad. It's actually disgusting how a civilian case that was going on the same time as ours in North Carolina in 2007. Uh, the only real similar thing is it was a criminal case that was being tried in North Carolina, but Michael Nifong, who's the prosecutor, so this case involved these Duke lacrosse team, preps, college kid players, wealthy families,
Mm-hmm.
and they hired this stripper. She was stripping, and she said she was raped, and they found that the prosecutor had prima facie evidence that exonerated these prep lacrosse team players, that they weren't really, no rape had occurred, and he omitted that and he withheld state's evidence. Well, they disbarred this lawyer, and people use that case a lot of times, like, hey, the Michael Nifong case, he completely withheld exculpatory evidence that exonerated these guys. but he was punished. And you look at our case, and what happened was far. I mean, there's multiple omissions of prima facie evidence that, sworn statements, reports from post blast, the Afghan interpreter, the driver in, the second vehicle, how these guys were threatened to be having their families deported, such greater violations. And what happened? Well, that investigating officer, he gets, screened and selected and took command, and you look at all these people, they got promoted, you know, the commander Marsoc, guess what? He got his third star. The plank owner, General Halleck at the time, he got his third star, went on to serve. So this is what happens is, it's again this magic trick, this misdirection. They're going to have you focus on something that's not even related. They'll have these flowery statements. Meanwhile, these guys' careers will be destroyed. Best case scenario, the absolute best case, if they get dismissed, they won't get promoted. They'll hit service limitations. They'll get forced out. They'll have to work for a contract company well, they'll try because they'll have to answer the questions. Have you ever had your security clearance revoked? To which they'll have to answer yes. And that will disbar them. I mean, there's a reason why when I retired, I started my own business installing automatic teller machines in the urban core of Kansas City, Missouri, the most dangerous, carrying around hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash because I couldn't get any other job. I applied for over 700 jobs. So this, I know firsthand how devastating this is to them and their families. And what usually happens is guys get divorced. It's the financial repercussions destroy the rest of your life.
Guys commit suicide also. Like how many guys were put under this knife that, the pressure of trouble and succumb to it,
Right.
we're not talking about that. We're not talking about what's led to that. We're not talking about this corrupt system. We're talking about these three guys, and they need to be made an example of. And we'll keep this bullshit lie story that they went out and murdered someone. Um, who told this to the family?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the family of the deceased was told this, and just this lie. So it's um we it's got to be rectified in my mind. I can't sit by knowing what's right and wrong and see that this stuff is happening and just sit by and do nothing. And
Yeah.
um
That's a good thing is your listeners they can, if you put it on your podcast, they can sign a petition. They can contact their congressman. They can contact the president. As I mentioned before, do not put on there that you're in the military or were in the military because that gets diverted. So it basically is a total waste. And, contact these guys during town hall meetings. And then they really want to donate to the United American Patriots, their legal defense fund, so that these Marines, aren't constantly having to pay out of their own pocket. They can have their legal fees. They shouldn't have to pay legal fees. And the government's way is saying, well, we'll provide you with an attorney, and how that works. They've gone through this is they get some young attorney who's juggling multiple other cases from defend because he's a defense attorney, so he's defending some guy who's pedophile, some guy that has a DUI, like General you did before.
mhm.
All these other cases, his is just one of many, and they're. I mean, but the consequences of a manslaughter case are far higher. So that's why they go out and retain civilian defense counsel, these
Mhm.
lawyers, but they're not cheap. These are not DUI attorneys. These are guys that specialize in these
Yeah.
war crimes, or
Well,
this isn't a war crime, that is homicide type cases.
and sometimes you're having to, send the defense is having to hire investigators to travel around the world, even to some
Yes,
of these war zones to gather information in their defense. So
right.
that's that's not cheap. You don't get free airline tickets for your defense just because
No.
you were in self defense. And there's been there's there's a lot of cost involved. Not to mention just the stress on these. Like, can these guys survive the stress of this? What health issues are going to pop up and everything else? I mean, is we got to get this thing disposed, and
Yes.
if not, we need to show up to this court martial and ask on camera, like, hey, why are we being kicked out of this right now? What what can't think of the word right now, but like, what exonerating information are you about to be talking about right now that you don't want us to hear? You know,
Yeah.
um, and ultimately, hopefully we can get the eyes of the commander in chief's awareness onto this issue, and maybe he can start taking some actions to not only clean up the justice system uh, within our within our private prisons, which are obviously have their issues too, but the fact that some of those same issues are actually worse as far as like conviction rates and not having a impartial trial. All the things we've listed, why is this type of injustice happening to some of the most patriotic military members and war fighters and their families?
Yeah.
The people who constitute our military, the ones who are, even though recruiting numbers are way down and they're having trouble getting people to join the military, um, these families who are dedicated and feel, hey, I need to serve my country. My father taught me growing up. He's like, you serve your country in some way, shape, or form. It was just understood that I was going to join the military. And yet, these are the people we're going to bring the worst injustice upon.
Yeah.
It really needs to be cleaned up, and I really hope we can get President Trump's attention on this issue.
Yeah. I believe we can. It just takes everybody taking action. It doesn't cost them any money. It's very cheap. It just takes some time and a little bit of effort, and they need to know what they're talking about. So I recommend people educate themselves. You've put some links on your site of some of the media articles that recently. There's one in the Washington Examiner that Phil Stackhouse, who's defending Gunnery Sergeant Dan Dreyer, he spoke about it. It explains the whole case, and there's videotape in this case that show firsthand what happened and what didn't happen, and that to me is clear cut. I mean, it's cut and dry. And you'd think that this would never have gotten to this level, but that shows you the direction that this is going. Is they're gonna have a witch trial. Somebody's gonna get hung and burnt unless these listeners take some action, and it can happen. That's why, I mean, President Trump has taken recent action in several of these cases, and it's good that he is. It needs to get exposed more. But the first real target to hit and drop is that we have a very corrupt case with these three Marine special operators, and this needs to be disposed of immediately.
Yeah, and maybe consider what kind of command climate is leading to this sort of injustice. You know, maybe Daniel Yu needs to be relieved of his duty if he's creating this sort of culture in this kind of environment. Because ultimately they're not meeting the mission, the mission of the DoD, the mission of SOCOM, the mission of MARSOC. They're they're not meeting the mission, and we need to change this structure and find who the real leaders are and start getting them in these places.
We got to drain the swamp in the military. Bottom line.
Yeah. I've even had talks with my older brother, who's a West Point grad infantry officer, about maybe it's time to get rid of the officer corps. Like maybe we need a restructuring of our military rank structure. I don't know, but something drastic needs to happen.
Yes. The Marines, they've always talked for years about going to this 360-degree evaluation system where everybody, your peers, your superiors, the Marines you lead, they all have input. Of course, the Marine Corps doesn't want to go something like that. They don't want other people, in the Marine Corps, you get promoted if your boss right above you is happy. That's it. That's all it takes. So people,
and you write your own evaluation. You write your own evaluation to your boss, telling him how good you are. Look at these guys I hold accountable.
That's a shame.
Well, I think this kind of rounds it up. I think I'm going to mention one more time. People, contact your congressman. We can't reiterate that enough. There's a petition going around, and I'll have these links all here. So sign the petition. Consider donating money to the foundations who are providing some financial support during this for the civilian defense. Because it does cost money. And so the Recon Sniper Foundation, UAP.org, and that's United American Patriots, if I'm not correct.
Yes.
And then the Recon Foundation. So I'll include all the links to this. I'll even I'll mention it at the beginning of the podcast if you need to rewind or whatever. But just please take action on this, and ask your congressman to join the Justice for Warriors Caucus. Let's try and get as many representatives as we can in there, and tag at Real Donald Trump in these, on Twitter, or share these podcasts, the information about these cases. What are some of the other podcasts you've been on explaining, talking about this case?
There is a One American News Network has a special that Neil McCabe is produced, and they can go to that. It'll have everything exposed on there, and there's several others. If you, I'll send the link. There's, as I mentioned, that article in the Washington Examiner where Phil Stackhouse, obviously now they've put a gag order on this attorney Phil Stackhouse. So they have to have surrogates, and which is, to me, it's criminal. But SOFREP stands for Special Operations Forces Report. SOFREP Radio, they did a podcast and explode before Phil Stackhouse had this gag order, and he spoke at length about this case with the CEO of United American Patriots, Dan Galvin. Explains the details of this case, but this story here is very inclusive, explains the details. Hopefully your listeners took some notes and can talk to their congressman about this, because Americans should stand by and say, hey, I'm willing to allow these 3 men or any other men and women who serve their country, especially those on the front line, that's where, the friction is when you send people down range, they're in a war zone, stress is high. Some things like this unfortunately come up. And it's when it's in this gray area, like in our case, we were blown up, we were shot at, we were trapped in this kill zone, and we returned fire and we're killing these people who were shooting at us. It was at 9 o'clock in the morning, so it was a clear morning. It wasn't fog of war. But then it goes, he said, she said. All the Afghans were saying, the Afghans said that we were drunk, that we dismounted our vehicles, that we went door to door just gunning women and children down. And they believed that. And that morning, we saw that as we entered that village, the atmospherics had totally changed. There was no one in that village besides military-aged men. And, we knew, okay, something's about ready to happen, because it's just fighters lined up on the side of the road. But, again, it's distorting the truth, and it's misdirection. There is an agenda. There is a reason why this is going this direction, is because the means to an end is they'll sacrifice these 3 guys so they can get promoted. They don't care at all about it. General Yu has slandered, has destroyed my character at a high cost. He told this guy, the military commander, that he didn't recommend that I serve in his unit at all, that this was embarrassment to the Marine Corps. And so that destroyed my career in the military. He's never made a statement saying it, because he has no honor. He has no courage. He's an individual that is willing to sacrifice others. To this day, he can come out. Any of these guys can say, "Hey, what happened was wrong, and these Marines did the right thing."
Uh,
And if they don't want to say it, they can show it. They could award these plank owners, the very first Marines to stand up and serve and deploy and fight and actually bleed. They could give them this Marine radar device, but they've said no. They will not allow that. So these enlisted Marines will never get what they rightfully have earned, have bled for. It's disgusting.
well, Fred, I also think we need to continue to, ask and demand that the military rectify the MARSOC 7 situation, because in my eyes it hasn't been rectified. And how many years later? This was back in 2007.
Yeah,
Um,
13 years later, and you're
and
right, they should. But I would honestly, these our cases in the past. It's not right what happened, but the the focus needs to be the priority of fires. These shots need to be aimed at this current case because these guys are going to trial
mhm.
here in a matter of months, and this thing needs energy right now, and this target needs to drop and be destroyed.
Yeah. All
These
right.
guys are going to get it. Our effort can wait till later, but we appreciate that. But these three men should not have their lives and their families destroyed, you know, at the expense so that these other leaders can get their third star. That's disgusting.
It is. It's it's absolutely disgusting. The So people, please share, share this podcast, share the other podcasts that have been done about this, tweet them, share them on your Instagram stories, Facebook, share the Washington Examiner story by Phil Stackhouse, because now he has a gag order. He's not going to be able to say anything else except for through other people. So let's share the shit out of this information, get it out in the public view. Fred, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about this, um, and being so vulnerable and sharing your own story and your own experience and continuing to fight for not only yourself and the men you served with, but the men in this case and their families, and fighting for justice. I really appreciate you and admire you for what you've been doing after faced with this, because I think a lesser man probably would have um, just ignored this, just like, hey, I survived this thing and I just don't want anything of it. But it says a lot about you that you've been very proactive and fought this for so many years. So I commend you and thank you for fighting.
Well, thanks for shining a light on this, Dan. This is a huge moral hazard in American society. Again, the largest nation's employer. If we allow it to happen to a few, it's going to happen to more. This is one case, unfortunately, of several. So I appreciate being invited to talk about this case and how it's affecting these men.
All right. Well, um, again, thanks for joining me, and look forward to taking action on this case. So, all right,
Thank you, Dan.
we'll call it.